In this lecture, we are going to see Marxist theory of state, right? Marxist theory of state. To understand Marxist theory of state, we must recall what is Marxism, right? Marxism is a doctrine, Marxism is a theory which talks which talks about workers, which talks about class, which talks about class struggle, right? This is Marxist theory. It talks about dialectical materialism. It talks about it talks about inequality. It talks about alienation and all those things. But the one of the idea which we have understood in Marxist theory is historical materialism, right? What this idea is, this idea basically wants to say that history moves due to fight over material resources. History moves because there are classes. When there are classes, there is class struggle. And when there is class struggle, there has to be what? State, right? There has to be a state, right? Recalling historical materialism in a small detail, what I will say that primitive communism, then master slave society, then what happened then noble and serfs feudal society, capitalist society, revolution, dictatorship of proletariat, and communism. In master slave society, in slave society, in feudal society, and in capitalist society, what we see that classes exist. When classes exist, right? If class exists, class struggle will also be there. Now, what is the issue with class struggle? Right? When there is struggle, there has to be a neutral arbiter to solve a conflict. Right? There has to be a neutral arbiter to solve a conflict. That is why state will also exist. Classes exist, class struggle will exist, and that is why to solve that class struggle, state will also exist. Right? Now, the view on this state. Liberals, we have seen, liberals say that state is a neutral arbiter. State is a neutral arbiter. State is a player. Is not a player. It is a umpire. This is liberal view. Marxist, on the other hand, what will Marxist say? State is not an umpire, not a neutral arbiter. State is an institution of class. This is liberal view. We are going to see Marxist view, which is criticism of this liberal view. And Marxist view will say that state is an is a class is a class institution. What do Marxists mean by state as a class institution? What they mean is this thing that state will work for dominant class and state will act in a way which is detrimental to interest of subaltern class. Where In a situation where liberals say that state is a neutral arbiter, state is an umpire, Marxists say that state is a class institution. State is a class institution which works for dominant class, right? If classes do not exist, class struggle will not exist, then state does not need to be existing, because primary function of state is to resolve conflicts, right? In this situation, this is the basic Marxist theory of state, whereby state is a class institution. It is not a neutral arbiter. If classes exist, class struggle will exist. If class struggle exists, so state has to exist. If classes and class struggle do not exist, there is no need of state, right? This much, this much that we have seen, this much is known as force theory of state. Force theory of state, and it is a criticism of Hegel's 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 theory of state is March on God of this earth, right? This is criticism of Hegel's theory. This is also known as force theory of state. This much that we have seen, right? And this much that we have seen is basically the instrumentalist theory of state. I was instrumentalist theory of state, right? We are going to understand instrumentalist theory in more detail right now, but this is the basic of Marxist theory across instrumentalism and relatively autonomy theory or structural theory, right? This is the basic. On this basic, there are two strands: instrumentalist and relatively autonomy. Instrumentalist and relatively autonomy. There are two words, right? I will try to explain these words first and then jump to theory so that it is easier to understand going ahead, right? Relative autonomy theory. When I speak about instrumentalist theory, you have to remember everything that is Marx, right? Everything that is Marx. Always remember Marx when I speak about instrumentalist theory, whereby Marx has said that there is basic structure, and basic structure reflects itself on superstructure, which means economic base is more important, right? Just remember this. And relatively autonomy theory, if I'm trying to explain, always remember Gramsci, that there are two structures: basic structure and superstructure, and these influence each other equally, right? So this is going to be helpful. So I'll start with instrumentalist theory of state. We will try to understand instrumentalist theory, and we'll try to apply instrumentalist theory in contemporary times. Instrumentalist theory of state. What is instrumentalist theory? Instrumentalist theory was explained by Marx in books like Das Kapital. Das Kapital is there. Das Kapital, Communist Manifesto is there. Then Frederick Engels, Socialism, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, right? Lenin has talked about instrumentalist state. the state in the state and revolution. For instrumentalist theory thinkers, instrumentalist theory scholars, philosophers, what they will say that they will say that what Marx says that basic structure is economy and everything else is reflection of it. Excuse me, sorry. So everything else is reflection of it. Basic structure will control everything else. Economy will control everything else. This is basically instrumentalist theory that economy will have its strings working on state. If you have seen that meme whereby there are multiple what you call in Hindi is Katputli, right? There are multiple Katputlis are there and strings are attached to them. You can understand by imagining that situation, right? Dolls and strings are attached to them. So the state will be sitting down and economy will be pulling those strings. That is basically instrumentalist theory. Who is pulling the strings? Economy. And in a capitalist society, who are economy? In society, capitalist will control economy, for which Marx will call bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie controls economy, and bourgeoisie in the same way will control state, right? Bourgeoisie or capitalist will pull the strings of state to act according to its whims and fancies. So state is a instrument of bourgeoisie, right? State is an institutions of bourgeoisie, and state is class institution, right? Two things that we have understood, that state is bourgeoisie institution and state is class institution. What do you mean by class institution? That state is instrument of dominant class and state is instrument of bourgeoisie. For which Marx says that there is this very famous quote of Marx. He says that state is executive committee of bourgeoisie class. State is executive committee of bourgeoisie class. What does he mean by that? Right? It is basically state is an instrument of bourgeoisie class. State executes whatever bourgeoisie says to it. Right? This instrumentalist theory, right, is criticism of liberal theory first. Right? It is a criticism of liberal theory, whereby liberals will say that state is a neutral arbiter. State is an umpire, not a player. And on the other hand, instrumentalist theory is also critique of Hegelian theory of state. What does Hegel says about state? He says, and this quote becomes very important of Hegel here. Hegel says that state is march of God on this earth. State is ultimate idea, right? State is ultimate idea, and state is everything that is good. everything that is good on this earth, right? This is the second criticism. First criticism is of course of liberal theory, which suggest that state is state is neutral player, right? State is neutral player. Against this, against this, Marxist will say basically state is not a neutral player or state is not a march of God on this earth. In criticism of this, Marxist will say state is an instrument. State is an instrument and state is an instrument on basis of which capitalist class will use their force on working class. That is why instrumentalist theory is also known as force theory of state, right? Instrumentalist theory is also known as force theory of state because state represent use of force by dominant class on working class. So this was instrumentalist theory of state. And how do you break this force, right? How do you break this force? By revolution, by destruction of state. This was instrumentalist theory of state. Now we'll understand other the idea, the other idea that 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 is there in Marxist theory. I have understood you instrumentalist theory of state, where we kept in mind Marx. Right. Now I am going to tell you relative autonomy theory. In relative autonomy theory, who do you keep in mind? You keep in mind Gramsci, right? You keep in mind Gramsci. Gramsci, what Gramsci has said that there are multiple structures. Not there are not multiple structures. There are basically three structures. Basic structure is still economy, then civil society, then political society, which he calls state, right? For which he calls state. And what Gramsci says that the influence is bidirectional. State and basic structure both influence each other, right? This is relatively autonomy theory, right? What are the sources of it? Gramsci is of course there. Gramsci and Gramsci's collection of his thoughts in prison notebook. Then we have Marx, who has talked about relative autonomy theory, who has talked about relative autonomy theory in 18 Brumaires, 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Louis Bonaparte. This is a book by uh, Marx, right? Then we also have seen Althusser in his book Ideology and Ideological State Apparatus, and we are going to understand Poulantzas as well. Poulantzas as right. We, Poulantzas will see in a separate thing. Right now, let us understand what does Marx mean by What does Marx mean by what does Marx not mean by what does Marx mean by relatively autonomous theory in his book 18 Brumaires of Louis Bonaparte? What does he mean in this book in relatively autonomy theory? Right? Marx actually Marx analyzed Bonapartist state. How Bonapartist state, right? How Bonapartist state is functioning. How Bonapartist state is functioning, right? And in understanding Bonapartist state, he says that Bonapartist state is such a state which has strong executive, strong executive. What this will do, what strong executive state will do, that in normal times, it can show relative autonomy. It can show that uh, Bonapartist state in normal times will show that we are with people. They will take out welfare even, right? They will undertake welfare. They will do social justice and all those things. But in crisis time, they are with capitalist class. That is why it is a relatively autonomy theory. In normal times, in stable times, such state can can work for its subjects, for workers. But Bonapartist state in crisis time is with capitalist class. That is why it is a relative autonomy theory. And what is the issue with strong executive? What happens with strong executive, or what is the issue with Bonapartist state? Right? With strong executive, mode of production is not defined. Why it is not defined? Because capitalist can be in power, and powerful people can make their own companies. So mode of production is not defined. So state and businesses are very much interconnected. There is no mode of production which is defined. If mode of production is not defined, there are not only two classes, there are multiple classes which exist. Multiple classes exist. When multiple classes exist, who has power over mode of production is not defined, which we were understanding to be with capitalist class. If multiple classes exist, power on mode of production is not defined, right? Such Bonapartist state is susceptible to military coup as well, right? Don't worry, I will may explain you with some examples as well. I will take example of Pakistan, right? And and such state will reconstruct after war, right? We should ideally take example of France or Germany or Italy, because Pakistan is a post-colonial state. So we'll take Germany, right? Germany, Germany had this very famous and very famous statesman, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck, Bismarck's policy of blood and iron, right? Bismarck was a great statesman. That is why Bismarck was a great statesman and he had a lot of power in Germany, and that is why the the executive of Bismarck. Bismarck was himself was not the king. He was actually, I guess, he was a general, like something like that. So Germany of time of Bismarck had a strong executive. This strong executive in normal times work for the common public, its subjects. But whenever there was crisis, it sided with capitalist class. Right? During Bismarck's time in Germany, we see industries are booming, but this industry are booming like what? Right? Industrialists are in power, and people who are in power, people who are in state, are setting up industries. Industries are there. Power is not divided as um, workers and capitalist. There is some other class there also, right? There are feudals as well. There are peasants as well, not feudals. There are peasants as well. There is middle class as well. There is capitalists as well, and there are workers as well. So there are 4 5 classes, right? When there are 4 5 classes, it is not clear that who has power on mode of production, right? Who has power on economy? Is it state? Is it industry? Right? When there is a strong state, when there is strong executive, who has power on industry? Is it the owner of industry? Is it the state? Is it the managers there, or is it the workers there? It is not really clear. When this is not clear, that who has power, then then that state is relatively autonomous theory. Everyone is influencing each other, right? Relatively autonomous theory, Bonaparte state is susceptible to military coup. Military is also a class there, right? We are assuming there are only 2 classes, whereby capitalist class, in instrumentalist theory, we are assuming that capitalist class will pull the strings on state. But we are forgetting military as a vector. We are forgetting military as a dimension, right? If we say that military takes away the power of the state, then state is not really that strong, or capitalist class is not really that strong. So relatively autonomous situation is there, that everyone is influencing each other, right? As I explained in instrumentalist theory, think in the way think in the way that capitalist class is pulling the strings on state. In relatively autonomous theory, I will say that think think a tug of war, right? Think a tug of war, but a tug of war not between 2 opponents, but 5 opponents which are pulling in different directions, right? Right? People are pulling in different directions. They have equal power, so nobody is able to move anywhere. Nobody is able to get all the power. There is equilibrium of power between 4 5 actors. That is basically relatively autonomous theory. That nobody has absolute power. Power is diffused, right? In simple model, what you say, that there is state and there is superstructure, right? There is not there is state, not state and superstructure. There is basic structure and there is superstructure, right? Think it as a tug of war. So economy will pull in one direction, state or and superstructure will pull in another direction, and they will influence each other. Absolute power will not be with state, superstructure, or with basic structure. This is relatively autonomous theory, right? This is basically the relatively autonomous theory. Bonaparte state. Bonaparte state is the basic idea behind it. Gramscian Gramscian state or Gramscian idea of state is relatively autonomous theory. It is also known as structural theory because, of course, Gramscian influence is there, right? This Bonaparte state, this Bonaparte state can also be understood as counter-revolution. Counter-revolution by elite against communist revolution, whereby elite will diffuse some of their power. Capitalist class will devolve some of its power so that communist revolution won't happen. Right? We have actually understood Gramscian state, Gramscian idea of two types of state, Gramscian theory of state, whereby there is a transparent state and there is opaque state. This we also have to write if question comes on relatively autonomous theory of state. Gramscian state is of two types, transparent and opaque. What do you mean by transparent state? Where civil society is absent and and the exploitation is visible. Opaque state is civil society is present and exploitation is hard to see. That is why revolution is hard to carry out. Right? Again, how do you how do you bring revolution? How do you bring betterment in any of the Marxist theory? Right? They will say that do one thing, do revolution, change the system, you will be better off. Right? In every kind of Marxian theory, you will find revolution as the solution. Right? In understanding, in understanding Marxist theory more, Marxian theory more, we have to understand, we have to understand a debate, a debate which is Miliband and Poulantzas debate, Miliband and Poulantzas debate. That we'll see in the next lecture. I hope this was helpful to you, and we'll start with debate between Naraj Miliband and Bob Jessup, and then we will see post-colonial state. Hope it was helpful. Thank you so much.